The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement, quote, "All I can say is that in the 22 months that Mr Hyde has been a minister in my government, he's shown very good judgement and he has my full support."
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. How was it good judgement on Mr Hyde's part that he chose to cover up his Law and Order spokesman, Mr Garrett's theft of a dead baby's identity?
The Right Honourable. The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, you may recall, sir, and I'm sure that the clerk will be able to advise you that there are Speaker's rulings about the relationship between a Prime Minister's responsibility for his ministers and a Prime Minister's responsibility for the action of ministers as leaders of parties. Now, this, of course, was canvassed very well by the opposition in question time in 2002, where the Honourable Helen Clark, Right Honourable Helen Clark, came up with the theory that it depends on what hat, I believe was the term used, a minister has on at the time. That question, sir, is right outside of those Speaker's ruling provisions and cannot stand.
I'll hear the Honourable Darren Hughes.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the House is quite right that this issue has been canvassed by the House quite a lot, and I'd refer you, sir, to volume 648 of Hansard at page 17315, where the then Leader of the Opposition, John Key, said, "Is the Prime Minister saying that the new standard for the way she will measure how ministers are performing is solely on their performance in their portfolio?" It was very critical that would be a measure only. What the Leader of the Opposition is asking, sir, is about judgment of ministers beyond just their narrow portfolio responsibilities, but for the way they conduct themselves in the execution of their warrant to be a minister, to be a member of the Executive Council. Sir, the confidence and supply agreement for this government relies on the ACT Parliamentary Party, which has signed up to a no surprises policy in respect to advising the Prime Minister of its composition, and the Leader of the Opposition's question to the Prime Minister is about the judgment of one of those ministers who's party to the confidence and supply agreement, and by the Prime Minister's own previous statement making the point that Prime Ministers shouldn't just have a new standard for the way in which ministers are measured solely being the performance of their portfolio.
Speaking further.
I'll hear the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, you need to see the whole of that Hansard, which in fact saw the Speaker, from my recollection, rule that wasn't a reasonable position because of Speaker's rulings established in 2002 that dealt with the then breakdown of the Alliance Party and particularly the position of the Honourable Jim Anderton, at the time Deputy Prime Minister, but for a time not the leader of the Alliance Party. Mr Speaker, there were numerous questions posed to the Prime Minister at that time, all of them ruled out of order because it was ruled that while the Prime Minister has responsibility for ministers and their actions as ministers, in other words, in discharge of their portfolio responsibilities, they had no responsibility for their activities as a leader of a party.
I'll hear the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Oh, well, let me...
Because this is an important issue.
Yes. In fact, I'll go further, Mr Speaker. It was established by Prime Minister Helen Clark that she didn't even have responsibility for herself. When she was acting as party leader, she could...
Order.
No. Well, the point is that you couldn't ask a Prime Minister about her decisions as a party leader, only about her decisions as a Prime Minister. And so it seems odd that you can't ask, if you like, the Prime Minister of New Zealand about his decisions as leader of the National Party, and yet somehow you can ask the Prime Minister of New Zealand about the decisions of another party.
Speaking to the point of order.
Well, I'll hear the Honourable David Parker briefly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I suggest another reason why this is relevant is that the Prime Minister has responsibility for the supervision of the application of the Cabinet Manual. And if I refer the Speaker to the 11th of September 2008 series of questions relating to the Honourable Winston Peters by the Honourable Bill English, the Honourable John Key around the same time, and this is one question, for example, that was in order: can the Prime Minister confirm that one of her roles is to supervise the application of the Cabinet Manual to her ministers, which says at all times ministers are expected to behave in a way that upholds and is seen to uphold the highest ethical standards, and that in turn is a reference to paragraph 2.52 of the Cabinet Manual, which notes that a Minister of the Crown, while holding a ministerial warrant, acts in a number of different capacities, ministerial, political and personal, and that all these roles, this is paragraph 2.43, in all of these roles and at all times ministers are expected to act lawfully and behave in a way that upholds and is seen to uphold the highest ethical standards. Sir, I suggest this is a matter that can be questions on of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker,
The Honourable Chair.
refer you to 1645 and the rulings repeatedly of Speaker Wilson in 2006 and 2008, the 2008 rulings, particularly applying to the situation that the honourable member raises. Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear that the Prime Minister is not responsible for answering questions that relate to activities of ministers in their capacity as leaders of parties. In any event, sir, in this case, the question goes back to a point where the Honourable Rodney Hyde was not a minister, and clearly there would have been no responsibility on the part of the Prime Minister, who at the time was Leader of the Opposition.
Can I just check with the Honourable Member which Speaker's ruling was he citing there?
146.5.
146.5.
Mr. Speaker, by point of order, sir, speaking to the point of order while you're looking, while you've got the book open, Speaker's ruling 147 bar 1, where a question impinges on the Prime Minister's official responsibilities as Prime Minister, it will not be ruled out of order just because there is a party connection. Clearly, sir, there is a party connection here. This is a question that the Leader of the Opposition is asking about the judgment of one of the Prime Minister's ministers and the no surprises policy that exists in the confidence and supply agreement that's been tabled here in the House as part of the government formation process and which is underpinned by the Cabinet Manual. So there is a case of not only of public interest but of ministerial responsibility to the views that the Prime Minister has on the judgment of one of his ministers, and the attempt here to try and deflect or refuse from answering questions about that serves only to further highlight why this is a matter of public interest as to the store and the level of respect that the Prime Minister puts on the judgment of one of his ministers.
I thank honourable members for their contribution to this particular issue of order, because it is a serious issue of order, and that's why I've taken some time to listen to members' views on it and to check on various of the Speaker's rulings, and members have quite rightly cited some important Speaker's rulings. This is a tricky issue. I freely acknowledge that, because the Prime Minister is certainly not responsible for the conduct of another political party, or even in this House as Prime Minister. He's not responsible for the conduct of the party from which he comes himself. The issue simply relates to whether or not the Prime Minister can be questioned on the judgment of a minister, and the Prime Minister is responsible for the judgments of his ministers. There's no question about that. What makes this particular question tricky is that the Prime Minister was questioned about the judgment of a minister, and the example given was an example relating to a matter to do with the ACT Party. And the question therefore turns on whether or not that rules out the question under our standing orders. And if one looks at the various Speaker's rulings that guide me, I think one of the members mentioned Speaker's ruling 147.1, which says that where a question impinges on the Prime Minister's official responsibilities as Prime Minister, it will not be ruled out of order just because there is a party connection. And yet, other Speaker's rulings, like someone, I think the Honourable Jerry Brownlee mentioned 146.5, that points out that Prime Minister's ministers are only responsible for those matters that fall within their responsibility as ministers, not as leaders of parties. But the Prime Minister has not been questioned on this occasion in his role as leader of the National Party. The Prime Minister has been questioned on the judgment of a minister, and the example that was given related to a matter to do with a party. It would seem to me that the most appropriate ruling for me as Speaker, that treads a pretty fine line, I acknowledge, is to ask the Prime Minister to answer the question insofar as it addresses the minister's judgment, and judgment generally, and the Prime Minister is not required to comment particularly on the detail of the matter relating to party matters. And I think that